Okay, hi everyone. Everyone here, right? Great. So
Hello.
welcome to the
Hello,
panel.
everybody.
Yeah, so our panel is called Overused and Underused Historical References. So it actually came up in a previous panel I was on. So I hope, yeah, we'll have a good discussion today because this topic is apparently of high interest. So let's start with introducing our panelists. And because everybody sees their screen randomly, we can't go in order, so I'll just call you out. So Ada, can you start? And I apologize. Yeah, I hope I'm pronouncing
Hello.
names
Yes,
correct.
hi, everybody. I'm Ada Palmer. I'm a historian at University of Chicago, focusing currently on the history of censorship, but a lot of my work is on European history, especially the Renaissance and Enlightenment, and also history of books, hence the censorship stuff. And I'm also the author of the Terra Ignota books, of which the fourth comes out in October. And of which the first one, the Compton Cork, to which I had aspired for many, many years because I've been going to Balticon since I was 12. And it was a great moment to grow up and win the award that I had aspired to for so long. So hello, Balticon, delighted to be home.
So Sabrina?
Hi, I'm Sabrina Vourvoulias. I'm a Philadelphia area journalist and speculative fiction writer. My novel, Ink, is an immigration dystopia novel that was published first in 2012 and then in 2018. I've written a number of short stories set in colonial Mexico, settler time frame Guatemala, and late 1800s Philadelphia.
Okay, great. And Anne?
So I'm Ann Nydam, and I do history primarily as, you know, a hobby and research and just interest. The book of mine that probably uses the most history is a middle grade book called The Extraordinary Book of Doors, which has ties to a Renaissance architect and King Francis of the First of France, so sort of early Renaissance there, excuse me. And then it's also got a big connection with Benjamin Franklin and his life and how he's a magician. So, but as far as my research that I do, most of that recently has been in the medieval European era. So I guess that's me.
And Tom?
I'm Tom Doyle. I'm the author of the American Craftsman trilogy from Tor Books, which has a lot of secret history in it. First starting with America, but then going kind of worldwide, where there have been magician soldiers and psychic spies working for various countries and areas throughout history. I also, I'm currently working on a series for graphic audio set in the 6th century BCE, of kind of secret agent, full of both real history and Wild Wild West sort of anachronisms and such, so kind of bronze punky. And my current book that's out is a space opera. It's but it is historically haunted. It's called Border Crosser, and it is a psychological space opera with a secret agent who is both seeking revenge and also seeking to gain control of the dials of her own mind.
Wow, sounds exciting. So I'm Anna Kashina. I write historical adventure fantasy and epic fantasy with elements of romance and a lot of sword fighting. So I like historical settings and I do a lot of historical research for my settings, and I love to mix kind of histories and cultures and of course to use some more of the underused historical settings. So I think, yeah, I'm excited to be on this panel. And because I'm the moderator, I'm also get to drive the discussion. So I think out of all our topics, I would like to start with the most underused historical references. And I want to ask all the panelists to comment on what is your favorite underused historical reference or historical setting, and maybe the one that inspires your own work. And again, I'm going to go in order on my screen, so starting with Ada.
So it's not a specific, okay, so I'll do one that's super mega narrow, and then I'll do one that's broader. It is an offense against the genre of fantasy romance that there is not yet a series about Roxandra of Wallachia, the vampire raven princess who is the granddaughter of Vlad the Impaler and was the ruler of Transylvania while her brother Machaia was in prison, and on the other side is descended from the Corvinus raven kings of Hungary.
Wow.
There needs to be a YA romance about her. She's real. Come on, people.
I'm to get to my keyboard already. This is like awesome.
But, which is similar. But I think one of the things that I notice a lot in when people are thinking about fantasy settings is not using or things based on history, not using enough hybrid modes of government. For example, constitutional monarchy, where there's a monarch, but there's also a council or a parliament of some sort, and there is a negotiation between the two. We tend to do monarchy or republic and not the many different bizarre grades that go in between that you get in so many different settings. And that is just an underexplored and awesome way that you can have your politics be set up, of which we have lots of real examples, including most famous, best known is England. But there's very little fiction which imagines a constitutional monarchy or another one of these hybrid balance and power systems. Also lottery in systems of government, Renaissance Florence, where people are drawn out of a bag to rule the city for a while. These other forms that are neither strictly monarchy nor strictly democracy are pretty uncommon and have a lot of potential.
Made me think of Queen Amidala, actually, from Star Wars, which was kind of like...
Yeah, which tries to have this complicated hybrid. It doesn't give us enough information to quite make sense.
Right.
And it's also kind of slightly doing the thing where Rome has a Senate and a monarchy at the same time for a while. And it doesn't really do deep things with it, but it touches it. But there's so much you can do.
Yeah, that's true. So Sabrina, what is your example?
Well, I'm going to stick with Mesoamerican and specify there has been a lot of fantasy set in Mexico, but there are significant differences between Mexico and Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, and particularly right before the colonial era, I think is an incredibly rich history that hasn't been much explored.
Yeah, I agree. So Anne, do you have one?
I'll add to that. I was going to mention the Mississippian mound builder culture, the Cahokia Mound area, which, I mean, there may, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody's written something about it, but I am not aware of anything set with that. Yes, Tom?
Alan Smale has done a fascinating
All right.
Cahokians versus Romans.
Oh, that sounds good.
It's fun. The Cahokians have discovered glider flight.
Yeah.
And that's what they use the mounds for. Head up there, and they have a kind of trebuchet or something that launches these gliders, and all of a sudden they have air superiority. But some more. There's plenty more that could be done without giving them the power of flight or whatever. But they're really fun.
Yeah, actually, when I saw the name of this panel, I immediately thought of Alan Smale's work. So yeah, totally.
So other non-European things that I think, oh, that was my cat. Other non-European things are some of the like Great Zimbabwe, the lost city of Zerzura in the Sahara. Like there's a lot of things that are, I mean, I don't know a ton about these things, and obviously there are other people who would, know a lot more about them, but I just see these little references, and I think this is fascinating. We need to do something with this. As far as Europe and sort of analogous to Ada's, I'm going to throw out Athanasius Kircher. He is the coolest guy ever from the 17th century, and he had so many fascinating real adventures that sound like magic. Everything from, he got himself lowered into Vesuvius to study volcanoes. He claimed to have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics. I mean, this was long before the Rosetta Stone. He was one of the last real legit scientists to believe in dragons. I mean, he's got all this fun stuff about him. And I much as Ada was saying, I'm like, people, why has no one written about this?
There could be 10 different cool fantasy novels about him, and they would all be interesting and different. Same with Roxandra. Well, often the answer to why there isn't fiction about it is there isn't very much material in English. And that the primary sources and even the secondary sources are in German or in Hungarian or in another language that makes them harder to access. And that is one of the big things that affects what history gets written about and what history doesn't.
Are there good epic, like folk songs about this queen? Does she have that sort of like the South Slav Guzlov material? Because having the brother in prison is like a trope of those.
I mean, the answer is very little of it has been translated at all. So even I haven't had a chance to look at most of the material, because Hungarian is not one of the languages I work in either. Yeah, but lots to be done there. I've been reminded of, I'm going to put it in the chat actually, a very interesting, though depressing place to start for ideas for a plot as well as a setting. Wikipedia has a really great list of destroyed libraries, which every one of which is a fascinating and powerful story. Many of them are libraries in antiquity, in non-European places and places you've never heard of. Every one of those narratives around the destruction of a library could become a fascinating science fiction or fantasy setting, or a fascinating historical fiction work. It is one of the most depressing pages on all of Wikipedia, but it's also just full of really compelling narratives. And many of these are, Central Asian libraries, or libraries in the Ottoman or Mamluk worlds that nobody that aren't famous. Some of which are much bigger than the Library of Alexandria, but just aren't well known. And the stories about them, whether you do lots and lots of research or whether you just take a nugget of what happened and use it to structure a totally original fantasy world, are great nuggets of narrative around which you have lots of material to work with.
So Tom, what about you?
Oh yeah, so I have a couple of, I'm not really stretching to other areas of the world and such, but there were just, right before this, there were two people, well, one's a stretch to another area of the world. There were two people who I just know the tip of the iceberg about, but I've always thought deserve, big fantasy, big alternate history treatment, or just historical fiction treatment. And maybe the stuff's already out there. One is Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, who just has this incredible life, sort of knows 5 languages, is engaged in a war with the Pope. Everyone's calling him the Antichrist. Some of the followers.
Are there any Holy Roman emperors who know fewer than 5 languages? I thought the average was 7.
It's got to be. I mean, this guy, he's supposedly, is one of his languages, I think, is Arabic. Which makes him a little different, but
no, they all need that.
They all knew Arabic.
They have to deal with the Ottoman world. I mean, they have to.
I thought him coming from Sicily, when I saw about it, they made a big deal.
Coming from Sicily is a difference, because it means he's had a different language background training in it.
Yeah.
But yeah, one of these. What's the unkind and yet informative joke? What do you call somebody who knows several languages a polyglot? What do you call somebody who knows only one language an American? That we forget easily that the norm throughout most of time and space of humanity has been to have at least 2, if not 3 or 4 languages. But sorry, he is really cool. I agree.
He is really cool. He's at war. He's called Antichrist. I think figures in the prophecies of the followers of Joachim of Fiore, and and yet not someone I see out there in the historical fictions, this speculative or otherwise. Maybe because he still resonates controversy.
Maybe he's still
the guy.
right about there.
So, and another guy who's maybe a tough for an American to write about, but Shivaji of Maharashtra is just one of these figures who seems like a sort of Atreides of Muad'Dib sort of guy. He's out there, he's captured by the Mughal emperor, he escapes from the prison, he is the kind of guy who goes to a negotiation with a couple of daggers under his sleeves to end a fight. He's he's an escape artist. There's, as far as the fantasy element, people who do the history of the magic of India and Indian stage magicians say, oh yeah, he was, he got out in a basket. He did the basket trick, to get out of Agra. So he's got all this sort of folklore around him already. And maybe that's the problem, but he's just an amazing person at a sort of amazing transitional time. So maybe someone will do something with him. Right now, I'm discovering that the 6th century BCE is very well documented in some places, but some places like India is not very well documented. And that's one of the things that really limits some of these underused, unless you just want to make, and just making stuff up.
Or depending on archaeological material.
Yeah, even the archaeological, it's a thin record.
Mm-hmm.
We know a lot about kind of what the religious texts say about certain figures from that time, but they themselves are, post-date the actual, they're not contemporaneous. So it's a hard period. But so those are a few of folks that I just sit there and wonder, why have I not seen the movie, much less a bunch of books. So
yeah. So yeah, I think I'll add my own. So my favorite setting and historical period is kind of like the historical world behind the Arabian Nights. So it's like ancient Middle East. And I'm just fascinated by this. So I have some novels either inspired by it or even set in like somewhat research. So I mean, research to the accuracy I could do at that time, but still like in a fairy tale-ish way. But yeah, I think that's both the world, which we know very little about, and the historical period, which we don't really see a lot of fiction about. And recently I got really addicted to a Netflix show, which is called Resurrection Ertugrul. And it's about the founder of the Ottoman Empire. And it's like, so you can say it's historical fiction, you can also say it's fantasy, because when there's a sword fight, usually one guy easily kills 20 other people, which I love because I also love to write about sword fights. But it's just the period of history which I knew nothing about, even though I am originally from that area of the world. So a lot of things are familiar. I feel like I should know them, and I didn't. And it's just really fascinating. So I feel like when somebody takes this less known historical period and really does a great job of showing it, it's just like nothing else. So yeah. So yeah, that's my. And then, so I guess this discussion prompted me to think, so a lot of references well brought up relate to some different cultures. And so when you are an author from one culture trying to write about another, so you tend to get under much more scrutiny in how well you get it. So if you are from that culture, people kind of believe you more than if you're from a different culture. But it's not to say that you cannot do it really well. So as an author, how do you approach, like, so if you decide to pick up something like this different culture, unknown historical period, and you want people to believe that you know what you're writing about, how do you approach this? And I guess you can answer. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
yeah, I even when it's 6th century BCE, you want to be, careful. I'm talking in those books about religions that have persisted to the current time, and that's something you don't, can't be cavalier with. And, in some senses, we're all very removed from 2,500 years ago. But in other senses, yeah, you're talking about some history that is still very much alive and part of the faiths of various people. So, really immersing into it. But there's also a sense of which I am trying to have fun. So it's tricky. I'll be interested to see if it works, if people appreciate the amount of kind of immersion that I've done into the various settings or not.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the settings is Egypt at that time, and another is Greece, and I'm leaning a bit on Herodotus, which is yes, he's kind of full of it in various points, but he tells the best stories. And so as far as to pilfer someone for story, he is perfect. And that period of time, it's just crossing over in kind of his reckoning from absolute sort of fairy tale more than 120 years before his time to, the time where, okay, we're starting to get more details, but still these odd stories creep in that, the first Cinderella story creeps into his telling of Egypt from around then. So he's, but, I can always lean on it and say, well, that's what Herodotus said. And so that's,
Yeah, I have to say research, obviously research is tremendous. When one of the stories that I wrote that was published at Tor.com is a story called The Way of Walls and Words. And it's set in colonial Mexico. There are two young protagonists. One is Nahuatl, indigenous. The other one is Sephardic Jewish. And it really deals with the Inquisition in the New World, which is something that there's some ability to get into it in depth, but in addition to that, you really have to apply your networks. I'm fortunate enough that one of my speculative fiction writing friends, David Bowles, another Latino like me, not only speaks Spanish, he also speaks Nahuatl, and he also speaks Ladino. And so some of, although I relied a lot on translations of poetry from Nahuatl, it was really terrific to be able to have one person I could go to verify language, both the languages I was working with. And then, of course, when you're working, I think, Tom said this, that when you're working with a religion in particular, it's important to have, readers with a lot more, depths of knowledge and lived experience. So there's a significant difference between Ashkenazi Jewish and Sephardic Jewish history and traditions, particularly in that time period. So, that was one of, again, sort of, I'm fortunate to have as broad a network of folks as I do to consult, but that's, as important, I think, as in-depth research.
I want to sort of throw out, we're writing fantasy. Like, we are not being accurate to reality in fundamental ways. So the question is, okay, you're breaking the rules. You need to have enough knowledge to understand which rules are, first of all, probably better not broken, because you are trying to be respectful and not, you know, mess with something in a way that is going to be hurtful to anyone. But whether I'm writing in my own cultural history or someone else's, I'm taking that history and I'm going, yeah, but wouldn't it be cool if, and I am doing something else with it. So I think it's kind of a question of trying to be respectful about what you're tweaking or how you're tweaking it, or, you know, so that you're, so that what seems to fun to me is going to be fun to all the readers.
I do think it's crucial what it is. I can tell you that growing up a Spanish-speaking Latina in the United States and watching old movies where the Spanish speakers aren't speaking Spanish is horrific to me. I mean, it does something, you know, sort of beyond what you would believe it does while I'm listening to it. So language in particular is one that I'm a real stickler about.
Well, I think if you're claiming that something is the reality as opposed to, you know, then it better be accurate. You know, if you're saying there's a dragon standing there, it's not accurate. But if you're saying, well, this is what they went to church and did, it better be accurate.
Yeah, I can relate to the language because as a native Russian speaker, when I hear Russian in a lot of movies, it's like a horrible experience. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would definitely echo the, you really want to, if you're drawing on a culture that has living people who identify with that culture, you very much want to have sensitivity readers who look at what you're doing with it. And if you're working with cultures that have languages that you don't have, you really want to find people who have those languages to work with. Those are definitely biggies. Another thing that I think is very useful is, well, two. One is seeing if you can look a bit at the historiography of the field, not just the history. So for those unfamiliar with the jargony term, that is the history of histories of that time and place. And the challenge there is that often there have been things that we thought, and then we discovered we were wrong and we changed our minds. Or things that were considered a dominant reading of something and then eventually weren't. And it's very easy to find a book that, oh, I'm working on, Vikings in Greenland. This book says the title of this book is Vikings in Greenland. This looks like the best book, but the book is from 1937 and we've discovered a whole bunch of new stuff. And it's pretty common for errors that historians have slaved for decades to try to battle to get revived in well-meaning historical fiction that doesn't realize that X is no longer the thing that we believe to be true. One place you can often find historiographic discussions very cheaply and quickly is on academia.edu, where a lot of people will upload their conference papers, which if you just search for the places you're looking for plus historiography, you'll often get something of a review. And another useful place, sometimes people email me and they're like, I'm writing a Renaissance novel, can you tell me the thing? And sometimes I have time and sometimes I don't. But every PhD student has to put together a historiography section and get quizzed on it. So they're super fresh on it and they have more time. And so if you look up a history department and look at a grad student who works on the thing that you do and you say, hey, could you give me a little intro to the historiography? If you've just written something on it, could you share it with me? They'll have stuff that's super fresh and they'll be much in a better position to share it with you. So for example, there's a lot of change over the theories of why the Viking settlement in Greenland died out. And there have been a bunch of different theories about this and old ones that have been discredited. Or one thing that's been affecting us a ton this year is that there's a lot of studies from the 1930s that say that the Black Death caused an economic boom. And every newspaper in the world has run the Black Death caused an economic boom. Will COVID cause an economic boom? Yay, stock market piece. And that, we're now sure that no, it didn't. It was just that the data for that one study was from one town where one particular thing was different. We've been beyond this for decades, but people keep finding this. And it only gave workers bargaining power in some regions. In other places, it resulted in the incrustation of serfdom and the stripping of rights from workers because workers were short. The problem is we used to only study this in Britain, and we had to look at Poland and Spain and everywhere else to realize that it was actually policy that determined the economic impact of the Black Death, and the economic impacts were wide variety. But not to get too far on the tangent, the point is you want to check on what are the big debates and what are the things that have changed in this, so you can do the latest stuff, which is usually more interesting, because generally over time we trend away from things we assumed were true because they were sort of the way the world normally was, toward things that are weirder and more unexpected. And so the latest history, in addition to being more accurate, is also just usually more complex and more interesting, more moving parts, which is useful for story writing. The final weird suggestion I'll make on this is it's really fruitful to read at least one, if not a couple, works that are set in where you're from, right? So set in America, written by somebody who's an outsider and is exoticizing and fantasizing you, so you see what it feels like from the other end and you know the stuff to watch for. So for example, if you read in the original Sherlock Holmes corpus, Study in Scarlet and Valley of Fear, which have long sequences in fantasy America, and there's no law west of Chicago, and it's full of evil Mormons. And when you read it, it's weird, but it helped you be on guard against doing the same thing when you're borrowing other cultures. Another great access point for this is anime or manga set in America or in Europe. And you see something like Rose of Versailles, which is a revolutionary shoujo, incredibly influential work from the 1970s, finally translated into English as this year, and set during the French Revolution, meticulously researched. Every date and every detail and every costume, meticulously researched. But then you get these weird moments where, the gentleman does something bad in front of the king, and his father is like, "You've disgraced us in front of the king. Now we have to commit seppuku." And you say, "No, you don't. You're French. This isn't a thing." But those mistakes are very telling to see and feel, and remind yourself that those are the mistakes you're prone to making as well. So in a funny roundabout way, that's one of the things that I think I recommend, is experiencing the exoticizing of your own culture, to have a feel of what you want to not be doing when you're playing with other cultures.
Dickens, Martin Chuzzlewit, I think, I mean, a lot of it was right, but still, it gives you the impression of how it feels to perhaps be told a lot of bad things. It took a while for him to recover from that in America after Americans got hold of that.
Yeah. Did you know all Americans have remote control lasers that can blast people from space because we all have guns? This is a thing that is sometimes true in anime of like all Americans. That not only do we carry machine guns around all the time, but we can also blast people with lasers from space.
Yeah, I think anything preceded by the word "all" should be taken with caution. So I'm going to take one question from the audience because it's kind of related to what we're discussing, and then we're going to move to overused briefly. So question from Jonathan Sexton. Jumping off that question about writing cross-culture, what's a good way of studying something when there aren't a lot of sources in the language you speak? How do you find resources when translation is unreliable? And maybe panelists can briefly comment or just put into chat what the resources they use. Yeah. Anyone?
Wow. I mean, do you want to go there if there aren't a lot of good sources? I mean, that's the thing. Depending, I mean, maybe you can go completely fantastical, as Anne was saying, and just you know, and it won't matter so much. But you know, if you don't have a lot of good material, and there are people who do know the material, do you really have to go there, I guess?
Yeah, I would say, you know, stick with, you know, the time periods and you know, the historical figures, you know, that you have a hope in hell of getting, you know, some languages, you know, if you have more than one language, getting some you know, decent research materials that you can.
Yeah.
So for
Or
me,
if
it's
you're
English and Spanish, and that's it, you know.
if you're in love with a detail from a period that it's hard to access material about, another thing you can do is take that cool detail and put it in a fantasy world, and you're using those bits that you were in love with, but then you're not worrying about
Yeah.
the fact that it's difficult to get a hold of material. You can just take the concept and run,
Yeah.
and that helps a lot.
And you're muted.
I will say the one thing to keep in mind if you're like stealing shiny bits is do give some thought to how they actually integrate with the rest of your world. Don't plop them in there without thinking about what other implications they will have or how they connect or why would that thing exist in this world that you have created. Because, you know, if it's integrated, it can be totally cool. But if it's just like, you know, I don't know what, but you just take this one random thing and plop it in, that can seem very appropriative, I think.
Right. So, well, or just not make sense, right? So let's say you want to
Which is also a problem.
Let's say you want to do something with Venice, and like they've built their city in the lagoon. There has to be something they were fleeing from to motivate building the city
Yeah,
in
a
the
reason.
lagoon,
Or maybe they're
right?
fleeing too. Maybe it's to
Yeah.
catch the fish, or maybe it's
Right.
because they want their glass making factories where there's plenty of water to put out all the fires, whatever it is. But yeah, make sure it makes sense. Make sure it's not just a totally isolated fun thing.
Yeah, I would add, I think that if it's a detail you really want from another culture and there is no reference in the language, you know, you could find the person who knows that language to translate it for you and maybe even discuss all this, like other implications of this detail. But yeah, obviously we can't do it as a research for the whole novel. It's very difficult. Yeah. So I will take more questions, but I wanted to ask another question from the panelists because it's in the title of our panel. Can you give an example of a most overused historical references?
Well, for a long time, you know, the Arthurian sort of medieval thing.
Yeah.
People have gotten a lot away from that now. So probably you could do something really fresh by going back there at this point. But for a while, that was probably the big one.
Yeah, I agree.
I do too. I love it, but yeah, it's
That can be
really hard to be original in it.
Yep.
I think
Everything. Oh, go on, Nydam.
No, you go,
Tom. You know, just American wars, Civil War, World War II, whichever American war. Those American wars have been overdone. I mean, maybe we need more Civil War stuff because we apparently have to remind people what values won. But, you know, just when you think a historical thing has been resolved, but I don't know if going back to that will help, particularly if you go back with an alternate history, because people seem to believe a lot of alternate history about it now. So, but yeah, just American wars.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that one. Also, I would be perfectly content to see no more, but that was a good Nazi characters. It's stuff. It's pretty grating. But I think another that gets overused and then has the corresponding underused is unwilling, unhappy arranged marriages.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many where like the girl is suddenly shocked that she's gonna have an arranged marriage. It's like, no, if you're from a culture that does a lot of arranged marriage, you're you understand how this works, you've been expecting it, you know, have sophisticated ideas about it, you have been planning and training for the skills you need. The question is, what place in the patronage network will I end up? And there isn't very much about arranged marriages from that perspective. Arranged marriages where the woman understands it and goes into it expecting the political complexities, and you know, that is a very underwritten narrative, whereas the sort of tearful, unwilling arranged marriage, which sometimes ends with the couple being happy and sometimes ends with the bad husband getting killed and her ending up with a different man or whatever, gets written about so much, and to me is much less interesting than, let's look at how arranged marriages were really done in this culture. Let's look at the ways that women exercise power in and through them. There's a whole lot of really cool, a lot of it quite recent material on this.
Yeah.
And yeah, it happens in so many different cultures in so many interesting ways, but there's very little literature about it that really
There's like
looks at it
sensibilities of
complexly.
the reader. I was I was thinking as you were talking, this show about the founder of the Ottoman Empire that I mentioned, and I put the name in the chat. So they have arranged marriages, which actually were happy marriages on that show. So it was done realistically. I think they don't force anyone, but they arrange marriages, and people go into it like knowing that they will have to fall in love after they get married. And so I'm absolutely addicted to the show, but it was very hard for me to stomach, even though like the characters were like super happy after they got married. It was fine. I just could not deal with it. And it's like, and this is something that, yeah, as a writer, yeah, you're right about something that really happened, but you have to sell it to American readers, modern American readers. And I found this hard. Especially.
Yeah, it is hard. You know, the example that my mind goes to, there's a really great manga called Bride's Story, which looks at arranged marriage along the Silk Road in the 19th century, which is really cool. But there were two different TV shows about the Borgias, both made in 2012. One by Showtime and one by a consortium that was partly US and partly European. And they did Lucrezia Borgia's first marriage totally differently. Where in the Showtime version, you know, here she is, her dad has just become Pope, she's 14, and they're like, you have to have an arranged marriage. She's like, I have to have an arranged marriage? This has never occurred to me before. I'm so upset. I thought I would get to marry for love. Yeah. And you're like, okay, that doesn't make any sense at all, but sure, you could do that story. I've seen that story 100 times. And the other one has her, you know, that her dad has been Pope for like 3 days, and she storms into his office. She's like, Dad, I'm 14 and I'm not married yet. I'm going to be an old maid. Who are you going to marry me to? I want to know what family it is so I can study up on the coats of arms and do all the political stuff. And I'm like, that's cool. That's different. That is a story I haven't seen a bunch of times. And it's less which one is more accurate and which one is genuinely more interesting. Has more complexity, has more things that they connect to. Because the arranged marriage where she's going into it for politics connects to all the different allies and keeps her connected to her original family. And, you know, they're interested in the families that she didn't marry, but that are marriage allies of the others. You can braid in a whole lot more characters there. Yeah. But when it's the unwilling arranged marriage, it just becomes about like her, him, and then maybe like her parents or his parents and a brother. And it's hard to weave it beyond that, and so you don't have as many hooks for character as you do.
I have to apologize to panelists and audience. We got our 5-minute warning. We have one more question in the chat, and I was hoping we can answer this question and also give everyone on the panel an opportunity to briefly speak about their most recent work. So let's see if we can do this. So the question is from Jeff Beeler. What historical settings would be good for science fiction stories? Michael Flynn and steampunk have done some. So maybe, yeah, panelists can briefly answer this and then we'll have to wrap up.
Almost any time can be a good science fiction. I mean, I did one called Pythian Games set during the Persian invasion in 480. And there's a science, it's skiffy. There's a science fiction story that I told. And I took just by taking Herodotus at his word. You know, you just look at the stuff, there's lightning weapons happening at Delphi, something science fictional to the modern reader looks like it's going on. Anytime you can find science
fiction. Especially any point where you have interesting scientific breakthroughs of that time, you can turn that into science fiction for those people.
Yeah.
Mhm. No, I think science fiction has to be futuristic to me, so which is like very biased and
Well,
If you want to
and-
do,
oh, go on.
if you want to do military SF, the War of the League of Cambrai is so convoluted and so many people betray each other over the course of it that it literally begins with one power inviting everyone to attack this one group, and then it ends with that group detending the original power from everyone else. Everyone changes sides at least once. You could write 100 different space opera stories using the military sequence of the War of the League of Cambrai, and they would all be nifty and unpredictable because there's so much weird changing of sides that happens in it. But another is often with science fiction, what's interesting is disparity of tech, right? When one culture has one tech level and nearby cultures have a different tech level. And for that, a really, really cool one to look at is the Hittites, who, when we're looking at early antiquity, right, there's the Egyptian empires and there's Mesopotamia and there's Greece starting to rise. And the Hittites have way less wealth and way less tech than any of their neighbors. And they mostly thrive by having land that isn't valuable enough to bother stealing from them and having a lot of horsemen. And they're so far behind a neighbor like Egypt in terms of what we think of as tech tree that they don't use a written language. They buy literate slaves from Egypt to maintain their documents for them because they don't have a written language. And the only library they possessed, this works for fantasy too, was a library keeping track of oaths people have made to gods, so that when there's a storm or a plague, you can look up all the oaths and figure out which one somebody accidentally broke, and therefore you know which god to placate. And that's their only written material. And yet they manage to be a peer of and trade with and sort of co-equal with these areas that we think of as so much more technologically sophisticated. And you can take that set of relationships when you've read into the details of it and port it to any tech level you want. You can port that to a steampunk tech disparity. You can port that to a, we have light speed, but you also have wormholes into other dimensions that we don't have tech level.
Ada, we are being,
Yeah,
tech person is.
yeah, sorry. So we can go to Discord and continue. So I may not be able to show up, but all the panelists and all the audience can continue the discussion there. And unfortunately, we're completely out of time. So thank you guys. It was a great panel. I learned a lot. Thanks to panelists.
It was
Thank
tons of
you.
fun.
Yeah,
You.
I'll
Great to
see
see you all.
Yeah, all right.